Hello and welcome to the Voice of Iron. And today, I just wanted to rant a little bit about Armored Core 6. In short, Armored Core 6 is neat. I've had the game for close to a year now, and I've played it on and off throughout, but I recently actually sat down and decided to finish through it. It turns out I didn't have too much left to complete, but man, what a fun time. More specifically, what a fascinating game, world, universe. It was a very, very good time. Armored Core 6, for those unfamiliar, is a mech game made by the same studio that would later go on to make things like the Dark Souls series and most recently Elden Ring. But Armored Core was one of, and I think possibly their first, video game series that centered around customizable mechs that you would pilot. Now, similar to Gundam, each Armored Core game, with the exception of the first two, takes place in its own continuity. So there are multiple sorts of worlds that are all under the Armored Core banner, and they're unified by the idea of Armored Cores as a technology. In other words, not unified so much by a single large story or world so much as they are by the technology that exists in it. In this case, armored cores or heavily advanced battle mechs. That said, this particular installment, Armored Core 6, while it does leave some wiggle room as to being potentially connected to some of the other series, it takes place almost entirely out in deep space on a planet by the name of Rubicon, hence the subtitle of the game, Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon, wherein you play a mercenary who drops to the world with a mysterious handler and have to take up jobs while slowly working to unravel the mystery of a strange alien substance called coral. It's a very, very fascinating thing because the world itself, or more specifically the planet of Rubicon, is post-apocalyptic and is slowly rebuilding its society after a disaster wherein the entire star system was engulfed in a sort of not quite starburst, because the planet's still there, but almost everything was burned across its surface. The apocalyptic event being the titular fires of Rubicon, and you're kind of picking through the ashes, all the while having to contend with and sometimes work for mega corporations who've come to the planet for its rare resource, and even further outside influences trying to keep the megas in check, all while the individual Rubiconian people are trying to fight for their freedom. It's a lot of fun, it's a great time, but of course, what attracted me to the game was its core premise, the idea of being a battle mech pilot. Those of you who have heard my thoughts on Battletech and MechWarrior probably are not too surprised by that, but the core element of driving a mech is fun to me. Now that said, because I went into this game initially with the expectation of mechs being, more methodical, not necessarily slow, but well-paced war machines that are heavier, while the machines you drive in this game do have a heavy feel, they're fast, which is to say, a lot of them use far more what I'm going to call rocket skating than they actually do running or walking, like in most mech settings. Not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, a lot of the components actually take up this idea that you're going to be spending a lot of time in the air, and some of my favorite leg designs, in particular the quads, actually have a built-in hover feature that are meant to facilitate this. And the game even stretches kind of what a mech is, or more specifically what an armored core is, as opposed to a standard mech, because some legs aren't even legs, they're just tank treads or tank bases or hover bases. But that said, they still have that kind of upper humanoid form, and the core itself, where the cockpit is located, dead center, is where your pilot sits. Now, you don't actually get to see the pilot at any point, at least not that I was able to find, and you can only find scarce images of humans by picking through data that you can find in missions optionally. I think I found like 2 still shot images of humans. But that said, other than not being able to see in the cockpit and whatnot, which I am a little partial to, it's very well told from within this system. Mechanically, the game plays, thankfully, not like a Souls-like game, for the most part. It is very freeing in that it allows you to build out your own sort of preferred mech. So unlike, say, Battletech or Mech Warrior, where you buy a chassis and then you can equip the chassis with different weapons and armaments and armor and whatnot, instead, the armored cores are based around universally swappable components, and while certain things are a little incompatible just because of power load and, what they can handle in terms of weight, overall, most pieces fit with most sections. So you can have a core, which is where your pilot sits, and then a sensor package made by a different company, and an arm set made by a different company, and legs made by different companies. It's all very interchangeable, and that allows you to have a very, very high degree of customization. Now, I do admit, sometimes the platforms as they come together, are meant to work together and do work very well. For instance, in terms of a single unified bespoke chassis, I actually rather like the Lemur Gear, which is a very fast, very agile quad mech design that I very much enjoy. And I found myself interested in what's called a double trigger build, where you put 2 rapid-fire weapons in the arms. I personally liked to put 1 rapid-fire machine gun in one arm and 1 assault rifle in the other. That way I had something with heavy damage but a slower shot rate paired with something that fired rapidly, and I had missile racks on my shoulders. I used some variation of that throughout most of the game, and it felt pretty good. Overall, though, you can make just about anything you want. There's missile boats, there's laser boats, there's energy weapons, there's plasma systems, there's really unique melee builds, which this game puts a lot of effort into. To me, the melee feels the most Souls-like out of any of the build types in this setting, but again, more often than not, it does not feel very much like some of the other FromSoft games that most people are familiar with. So, and to me, that's to its benefit. I'm glad that it feels like its own thing. The world itself is amazing. It tends to have this dark but hopeful tone throughout, and again, that backdrop of megacorporations meddling in an independent world and even fighting against a greater governing power together for a moment, and that underground movement of Rubiconians fighting for their own freedom. Despite it all, it's just phenomenal. I love that. And I don't want to spoil, especially towards the end of the game, anything, but there's fascinating mysteries to uncover and things to deal with. So everything that I've just said is just purely complimentary towards the game. That said, of course, it's not perfect. In particular, there is just one little thing that I want to ramble on, and that is one of the only parts of this game that I did not like. There is a certain boss I hate. I don't want to spoil anything because it is a pretty big spoiler, but in the playthrough that I did, it was the second to last boss. Not the final boss, but the second to last boss was the most annoying thing I could have possibly faced in a game like this. Challenging can be fun, but wasting hours because you input something a fraction of a second too late and getting staggered to death repeatedly isn't fun. Now, the rest of the game is not like this. If the rest was constant, a seemingly unfair struggle, like from FromSoftware's other big names, like Dark Souls, then yeah, that'd be par for the course. Half the fun of those games is facing insurmountable odds and overcoming it by slowly adapting. But most of the rest of the game isn't like this. The second to last boss is so much more difficult than any of the other bosses, for the most part, and astronomically more difficult and frustrating than non-boss challenges. I mean, was it satisfying when I did finally kill it? Yes, absolutely, immensely. But was that moment of satisfaction worth nearly 2.5 hours of stress and an AC build that frankly felt more like a cheating meta build than an actual mech I had designed? Absolutely not. By the way, minor spoilers if you don't want build information, but in order to actually beat that boss, I had to basically just strap 4 rotary cannons on this thing, 2 in the shoulder, 2 in the arms, and just make this thing heavy enough to carry those 4 and then light enough to move fast while doing it. It was cool to see that much firepower, but it wasn't something that I had come up with. No, I like my double trigger with missiles build, and I didn't feel like I could use that on this boss. Could I have eventually won with it? Maybe, but I had already spent nearly 2 hours on it at that point, so I just gave up and used this overpowered build. And that, to me, took away from the fun. Most of the rest of this game is incredibly fun and enriching and fascinating, but that second-to-last boss is just needlessly difficult. I suppose there's going to be some in the comments that are just like, oh, well, get good, but, I mean, again, if the rest of the game was very much in that attitude, I would probably agree and be like, yeah, that's, I should have expected it, but that's just it. It's so much more difficult than the rest of the game as to be out of place. But that said, that's my one major complaint, is that boss and then another similar one before it are unreasonably difficult compared to the rest of the game. But that said, the final boss itself was perfect. Challenging, took a few tries, but I didn't need some meta build to win, and it felt cinematic, challenging, and rewarding to complete. And ultimately, the game as a whole felt that way. It was never easy, but the overall game was thematic and fun. And with the exception of, those few bosses, the game makes you feel like any build can work and encourages you to customize a mech to your liking. And given that I came here for the mechs, I love that it has such a focus on that. So overall, I just think that the game and the setting is neat. At the time of recording, there is a show announcement called Secret Level that it's an anthology show that has each episode based on a video game world, and one of them is based on Armored Core. I assume Armored Core 6, just because it's the most recent one, but again, there's multiple continuities. For all I know, it could be in its own little universe featuring Armored Cores, but it looks fun. It looks great. You finally get to see the inside of a cockpit, which is something that I very much enjoy with mechs, and I'm glad that we get to see that with an Armored Core at least. And, yeah, it's just a very fun game. To anyone who is a fan of mechs, and I would even say those who are more a fan of the Japanese style of mechs that have a lot of rocket propulsion and thrust to guide them, as opposed to just relying on legs, I would say give this a try, give this a shot. It's a fun game, it's challenging at times, but other than one or two frustrating bosses, I really do feel like any player can, get through it with just about any build that they like without needing to get too meta, and overall it is a very, very fun experience. The image that I have in the background, I make most of my videos so that you don't have to look, but if you decide to, is the design that I ended up coming up with, that I ended the game with. I named it Number 13 because of a little nickname you get early on in the game, and I thought it sounded pretty good. So that's my mech right there, Number 13. And for those who aren't looking or prefer not to look up or driving or something like that, don't look at the screen while driving, folks. It's a bipedal design with 2 machine guns, 1 rapid fire, 1 assault rifle, and 2 rocket pods on the back. This thing is cool, it's fast, it can fly pretty decently, and overall, it's just a blast to ride in. For any MechWarrior fans who are coming over to it like I was, imagine if every mech was a light mech that can jump. More specifically, something like a spider, or even more accurately, a light clan mech with jump jets. That's almost every Armored Core. The cores themselves, or rather the mechs themselves, are a little smaller than the typical mech in a MechWarrior or BattleTech game. So, your typical battle mech in MechWarrior would be about 2 or 3 stories tall, maybe 4 with some of the biggest. Armored Cores, last I checked, were anywhere between 1 and 2 stories tall. Sometimes, by the way, you can find things like cars and buildings for scale, so if you ever get a peaceful moment, you can stand your mech next to it and just try and do some measurements yourself. I don't know if there's any official measurements that have been published, and of course with all the interchangeable parts that can change, but they generally seem to be around that range. Maybe you can eke out 2.5 stories, maybe 3, but overall they're a little smaller than BattleTech mechs and a lot faster. So just imagine that everything is a light to medium mech, like the heaviest being comparable to something like a Phoenix Hawk. But overall, yeah, I just wanted to talk about Armored Core 6 as a game, as a setting. It's a lot of fun. The mechs are fast, but They have such a variety and so many different sorts of builds you can put together. It's challenging but fun. There's only a couple portions that feel a little unfair, and even then, you can get through them just by adjusting your build a little bit, and the overall story is very satisfying, to the point where I didn't want to spoil any of it here. So that's why I've avoided talking about major story beats. Anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. I think Armored Core 6 is really cool. I'd love to check out some of the other Armored Core games at some point. All in all, it definitely scratches that itch in my brain that really likes big walking machines that you can drive around in and destroy stuff with. And I would highly recommend it to any mech fans out there. It's on Steam, and I would highly recommend it. Anyway, that's all for today's little rant. And as always, thank you for listening to my voice.